Another beggar, a man named Irus, arrives at Odysseus' palace and begins to harass the beggar in disguise. Antinous, the suitor, elects to host a battle between Odysseus the beggar and Irus. The winner will dine with the suitors, and the loser will be cast out. Odysseus soundly beats the would-be Beggar-King and is rewarded with a meal from the suitors. Penelope comes forth, blessed by Athena, and the suitors' knees went slack and their hearts dissolved in lust. The suitors bring Penelope gifts, and Odysseus sees his wife's actions for what they are, a plot to lure gifts from the suitors. The suitor, Eurymachus, offers Odysseus the beggar work, but Odysseus' response causes him to throw a stool at him. The book ends with Amphinomus calling for peace and leading the suitors in a libation to the gods.
Welcome to Ascend, the Great Books podcast. I'm Adam Minihan here with Deacon Garlick, talking about Odysseus' fight with Irus and all sorts of things on book 18. We are so close to being done with this year of Homer, which will be a lot of fun. But we're joined by a good friend who was here last week. I was not, so I understand that I'm on the chopping block for being replaced as a potential guest host with Dr. Jared Zimmerer. Dr. Zimmerer, it is great to have you on Ascend. I am curious, who do you think could bench press more, you or Odysseus?
Based off the description, definitely him. I fought no wars, so that's all. All him.
I thought you were going to pull like the Nestor back in the day because of the old guys, you know.
Exactly.
So
Dr. Zimmerer joins us again after a wonderful conversation on book 17. He serves as the director of Extensions Strategy at Benedictine College. Professor, it's good to have you again.
Good to be here. Yeah, wonderful conversation.
Yeah, you just need Athena, right? Like when you take off your shirt and you're about to fight the other beggar, you just need Athena to come in and give you some rippling thighs. Wasn't the line? In Fagles, that's the line. You get rippling thighs and a thick neck, right?
Exactly. And olive oil for the shear.
Some people need divine more than others. So
that's great. That's great. So I missed last week's, Deacon. So I just, out of curiosity, Dr. Zimmer, like, are you a fan of Fagles translation, or like when you approach the Odyssey, which book do you normally go to? What's your go-to?
My go-to book?
Yes. Which translation? No, which translation?
So I've read two of them, Fagles and Lattimore. I tend towards Lattimore just because that's what I've taught. So that's there, but I find myself appreciating different verbiage uses, especially adjectives and stuff that are a little bit different between the two. But most of my copies, I have about 5 copies. Most of them are Lattimore. So I just have all my notes in those. So that's why I tend towards it.
Yeah, I can totally get that. Like, there was one point in the Iliad when we were going through that I realized this book is worth more than like so many things. Like, I'd rather somebody almost steal my car than steal this book, because of like all my thoughts and all my notes that are in this book, like, is worth more to me. You know, I can't replicate these books. I can get a new car. I cannot replicate these books. You know, exactly. I got to that point. It was like a really weird moment for me. But anyway, sorry. Book 18. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. I've had the experience where it's like, I would rather leave my phone or my laptop on the airplane than the book I was reading, right? Because I can go buy a new one of those, but I can't buy this book that I have all my notes in. So anyway, all right, let's look at book 18 and kind of get into the narrative here. So Fagles entitles this The Beggar-King of Ithaca. I mean, one thing that sticks out to me immediately, you know, Dr. Zimmerer, as we work through book 17, and Adam, you'll just have to go listen to the episode, because we basically unraveled the entire Odyssey. We basically just solved it, is what we did.
Wow.
So, yeah, Dr. Zimmerer was throwing out his hot takes about false kings. It was great. I was giving some theories about Odysseus being like the Cyclops. Like, we just solved it. Like, we just unraveled it. Anyway, we're happy that you're here, and you can join us for this conversation as well. But what really caught my attention as we start off book 18 is with book 17, we saw Odysseus finally enter his home, right? Finally enters the palace. We kind of get this foreshadowing that, Homer very carefully couples Odysseus entering the threshold of his home with the death of Argos's dog. And so he talks about the shadow of death that actually kind of just overlays this. But we finally get Odysseus in his own home. And so that's book 17. And at the end of book 17, Penelope asks to speak to the beggar. And so now it's like, oh, okay, so book 18 is going to be Odysseus finally gets to talk to his wife face to face. Now, albeit in a disguise. And then we just get this like weird interlude book. And one of my questions is like, what is Homer's purpose here? Like, maybe I need to do the math on where they are in the 3-day, recital of the Odyssey, and maybe there's just like this is a lull, right, or something that he has to like get his audience re-engaged, because it's weird. Like we're about to meet Penelope again, and we get a fight amongst the hobos. I think Fagles even uses the term hobo at one point. Like, what does anyone have any great ideas of what's happening here?
I've got a few. It might start off with hot takes yet again. But part of what's happening here is the testing of Odysseus, right? And so as he gets closer and closer to the heart of his home, which ultimately is Penelope, ultimately is the chamber bed, he gets tested along the way. And if you look at book 17, he's tested in his honor and his humility. Can he go beg? Can he put on this mask and humble himself to the point of begging for bread? And it seems to me like in this one, it's testing his strength. As a warrior, can you control yourself? Can you control your anger before you move to the next step? And there's this beautiful scene, we'll get there eventually, but it's almost like he's like the equalizer or something. Like he has such control with what he knows exactly what he's about to do, even though as a warrior, he wouldn't even have to warn the guy, but instead he does say, look, you want to do this? This is not going to work out well for you. But it's him controlling himself. It's controlling his temper. It's controlling his physical strength. I see it as another step along the way of him becoming his full self.
No, I like that. That certainly gives it a lot more depth than just a fight of beggars outside the palace, right? That's what you're looking for. You're kind of looking for where's the layer here? Where is this, for Homer? And we also see Penelope playing a really strong role in this book as well. So I don't mean to like belittle it, but it really caught my attention this time as I was reading it through that, we're not given that meeting that we were kind of promised at the end of book 17. We have this interlude. And then, so of course, then, all my flags go up of like, what is Homer doing here? Because I want to view Homer as the teacher.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting too that go ahead.
I was just going to say, this isn't unique to Homer, right? This is the first time he's done this. Like he does this all the time throughout the Iliad. I can remember every time it's like, okay, this is the battle. We're almost there, and then we get something like kind of a side story. It's like, well, what does that side story mean? Homer does this often. I don't know if it's for rhetoric for the bards, or I'm not sure, or if it is kind of like what you guys are saying, where it's like here's a side story to kind of understand a little bit more of the character development, who he is, and like what he's having to do. As a first-time reader, sometimes like this is why I love these conversations, because I'm trying to track the narrative, like the literal. And I love being able to talk to other people who have, okay, well, hold on, let's think about this analogously, or let's try to think about this from a moral perspective. It's very helpful. This, again, another great reason why you should get together with other men to read good books, because you get a whole wide range of perspective from different people. But anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Dr. Zimmerer.
No, all good. I just thought it was interesting that in a way, Irus sort of mirrors Antinous. He's a bully in a lot of ways, but he doesn't have the power, the prestige, the money that it would take, to potentially go to war, because this guy's just a beggar just like him. So it's interesting that it's like he just doesn't like bullies, but this is one of the few bullies that he can handle right now in this moment. So it's kind of a foreshadowing of what's about to happen. Of when I strike a blow, it's going to be directly where I want it, and it's going to hurt you just enough for me to get you out, right? Because he drags him out to the court. But it's a very calculated, very understood move, and he even warns this person not to do it. So it's kind of a foreshadowing of what's coming.
No, I like that very much. Can we talk about his name? So I think I pronounced it Irus, whatever, however you want to pronounce it. Mm-hmm. But just on the etymology here, so it says, this is his nickname, but all the young men called him Irus or Short because he'd hustle messages at beck and call. So immediately I thought of Irus with an I from the Iliad, right? Who's the goddess of messages, right? Where she's constantly taking these messages back and forth. And she's kind of replaced in mythology. Like by the time we get to the Odyssey, which is not that far away, but by the time we get to the Odyssey, Hermes has almost completely taken over this role. But in the Iliad, she's a major character, right? She's a goddess. She's associated with the rainbow. Zeus is giving her messages. So, like, one, it seems like an allusion back to the Iliad and back to, I think, this an older mythology. But is there anything else that we can play with here? Because you're talking about the relationship between this Irish character and Antinous. You know, can we play with this or read it more deeply that his name is the one that brings the message, right, or gives a message?
Yeah, especially because Irus being more of a character from the Iliad, which we talked about last time, is far more the book of war, right? So this person is a warlike figure. He's somebody who wants to fight very quickly. Doesn't take much to push him into a fisticuffs, right? That's one way to look at it. But yeah, it's a very interesting why they wouldn't choose something closer to Hermes. But you also do see the use of winged, at least in the Lattimore translation, they say that quite a bit. And by that, they mean Hermes, right? The wings of his shoes.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting, too, like how opposite those two characters are. Irus and then this Irus, this beggar here, right, who's this kind of like overweight, kind of obtuse man. And the other one is this, delicate goddess of the rainbow. So, yeah, I mean, I think Homer's playing with a few things here as she goes out. Now, this is, the first time reader, Adam, I'm sure I was curious what's going on in your mind, because here we have Odysseus coming back home. We have all these kind of like deep narratives going on. And then we just have this beggar that's introduced. He's harassing Odysseus. And then Antinous gets the great idea that we should have a beggar fight, right? Like, hey, why don't we just put him in a duel? Right. I mean, this is like, we talked about him last time. Antinous always has these wonderful ideas, right? And he's kind of somewhat of the leader of the suitors. And so they're going to have this duel, and the winner will get to feast among them. And then no other beggar is allowed inside. Right. So hence the Beggar-King. So then Telemachus tries to like add a little bit of sense here. It doesn't necessarily work. And then Athena in Fagles is like down like 80 or so. I mean, it's just so funny sometimes what the gods get involved in, right? So now, like, they're going to fight, and Athena makes Odysseus, right, look even more powerful than he actually is, right? So he's like fleshing out his limbs of the great commander, right? His massive chest, his rippling thighs, his burly arms on display. And you get this almost comical thing where Irus then and all the suitors realize, like, oh, brother, you're about to get destroyed. Like, this isn't actually funny anymore. Like, you're just about to get annihilated, right? And Antinous is like mad about this. He's like yelling and flinging insults at his own, chosen beggar, being like, you clumsy ox, you're better off dead. You're never born if you cringe at him. Blah 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 blah. And then, yeah, it's just it does not last very long. Odysseus, takes him out. The suitors are all basically dying laughing. And then, what did you make though, Dr. Zimmerer, because as you mentioned earlier, I think you see Homer kind of playing with this narrative. What do you find with this? Because if I read this correctly, he drags Irus and basically puts a stick in his hand, right? And he's the scarecrow to all the pigs and dogs, but no more lording it over strangers, no more playing the Beggar-King for you, right? And he kind of puts up this character as a mockery at the end. What's going on here?
I think there's a lot. I think that scene in particular, there's certainly a lot of foreshadowing of, what is about to happen to the rest of the people that are inside all the suitors that are in the building. I mean, it's kind of this scene that you have like almost like the worst of frat boy culture, where all of a sudden two guys show up that are disheveled and they're like, hey, I know what we'll do. Let's make a fight, and it's as if Homer is just showing, because we talked about guest friend, and I'm sure every episode of this series is going to include guest friend reality. But it's the literal opposite of guest friend. Rather than inviting you in, hearing you, letting you sleep before I even know who you are or hear your story, I'm telling you to come in and fight this man, for our entertainment and for nothing more than a good meal. So it's literally the opposite, and ultimately that is an injustice to the gods. So I mean, it's literally taking it to the point where these frat boys don't respect the gods. They don't respect each other. They don't respect their guest friends. They don't respect the woman of the house. It's literally everything. And so in Irus, you sort of have like this character where all of that finds itself in one, and what he's willing to do is show out, bring it out, and basically, as Scarecrow. If you've seen Peaky Blinders, there's this great episode where the main guy gets put up on the X, and he looks like a scarecrow. And the reason being is because they were telling other gangs, you come anywhere near our land, this is going to be you. Mm-hmm. And that's basically what he's doing, is like any other suitors who want to come in here and do this nonsense, you're next. It's sort of his warlike way of doing it, but it seems far more schemed and controlled, not just the rage of Achilles, but far more tempered, modest. He doesn't necessarily take it overboard, because he could easily kill this person if he wanted to, but instead he smashes his jaw, basically shuts his mouth, and then drags him outside to make him a sign. So that's my thought of it.
Yeah, I'd like to think more about like Odysseus here being like strength under control. Mm-hmm. Right, because I mean, he certainly. I mean, it's not really a fight. I mean, it's a couple hits and he's down.
Right. I know last week we talked about Peterson's line about become a monster and then learn how to control it, and that's basically what you're seeing right here, right? And again, I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, but the whole scene with the equalizer, where it kind of shows him going through the exact moves that he knows he's going to do. He knows the timing of it. He knocks it out and then stops. He doesn't go too far. He doesn't do things that he doesn't will to do. So he doesn't let that kind of like seeing red show up. It's far more, this is a just act that I need to handle, and it's going to require some violence, but it's going to be just.
And it's interesting too. I mean, I very much agree with you that the whole thing in a certain way is a mockery of guest friendship, right? We saw last week with book 17 that there is an expectation that guest friendship should cascade down, right? So even though the suitors are guests, they have plenty, and that should actually be shared, right? And we see that with Odysseus begging, and guest friendship becomes that test. Here we have this fascinating narrative where the fight itself is not just a violation of guest friendship, but then the actual king of the house has to fight, has to commit violence to even have a seat at his own table. Right, and then he's served by the suitors, and actually, the first one who brings him something, I believe, is Antinous. Right, he laid before him a generous goat sausage. Right, that's at like in Fagles, it's like a little bit for 140, and so he's actually fed then by the suitors at his own table. Right, but he has to actually commit. Well, I don't know if I would say he commits an injustice, but he commits something that I think is almost below him. If that makes sense, right? Like here's the king of Ithaca, and he has to fight a beggar outside. I mean, it's like you said, it's controlled strength insofar as it's so comical and ridiculous that this like veteran from Troy, that this is actually going to be any type of match whatsoever, right? But it kind of adds to this kind of layer of mockery of the guest friendship, and what's happening then, that the host has to commit violence to even have a seat at his own table. And then he's fed by the people devouring his home. Like you can just kind of tell that Homer's is playing. You're right. We talk about guest friendship on every episode, but we do that because Homer seems to be playing with it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then like right when how do you say his name? Amphinomus.
Sure.
Amphinomus. I don't know how you pronounce that, but it's very interesting how Odysseus goes straight from this understanding of maintaining this prudent separation between his actions and his emotions, the actions of violence and his emotions of violence, to almost like he gives Amphinomus like advice to live lawfully, and like and like hints like, hey, listen, these guys, these suitors, they're all about to die, and you should like kind of get the heck out of here. Like, what do what do you make of that? I thought that was very interesting how that those kind of like dovetail into one another.
Well, here's what I would say, and I think this picks up a thread in something that we were talking about last week with book 17, which is a question, I think, at the moment of how much autonomy do the suitors still retain? And what I mean by that is, like, what is their actual capacity for free will at this moment? Because last time, and we're going to see more comments here, and Dr. Zimmerer pointed this out really well last week, is that Athena doesn't seem to be allowing them to actually have any type of repentance. Even when they naturally seem to be moving that way by what they're observing, she seems to step in. And she does several times here in this book. So if you look at the passage that you pointed out, Adam, which starts, I don't know, about 140 or so in Fagles, this is Odysseus kind of giving this long talk. He has several kind of like fatalistic statements. Like if you look at like 150, he says, "Of all that breathes and crawls across the earth, our Mother Earth breeds nothing feebler than a man. So long as the gods grant him power, spring to his knees, he thinks he will never suffer affliction down the years." Like he gives what I would read as a pretty fatalistic commentary, right? And so he says, "So look at me now, and so I say, let no man ever be lawless all his life. Just take in peace what gifts the gods will send." So this is like a very fatalistic commentary by Odysseus. And it seems to resonate with our boy here, Amphinomus. Because if you look at like 170 or so, he says that Amphinomus made his way back through the hall, his heart sick with anguish, shaking his head, fraught with grave forebodings. So then you're thinking like, okay, some of these guys are going to get it, right? Because actually this is what we've been presented, is that Odysseus the beggar, in a certain way, is not just him understanding who's faithful or not to him, but also it's a test of the suitors themselves, which then you would think, oh, well, maybe some suitors will pass the test, right? And you know, so-and-so, Amphinomus or whoever will go home, right? They'll pass the test and they'll have some type of metanoia and they're out. But then it's immediately coupled with, but not even so could he escape his fate. Even then, Athena had bound him fast to death. So this is something that Dr. Zimmer and I talked about last time that I think it's worth mentioning again, which is, I keep going back to that statement with Argos, is when Odysseus enters his home, and there's that coupling with his entering the home in the shadow of death, is there really any more room for repentance for the suitors? Or are they done? So even here, Odysseus, I think, gives, a really good commentary on fatalism. It has an effect on a suitor, and Athena then runs interference for that suitor just to go back to the table and remain.
Yeah, I think also there's a bit of a mix of the fact that he tries to have mercy on this person and the person doesn't accept it. And that's ultimately what's fatalistic, right? Because justice, at least in the Greek terms, is not the same as what we think of it, right? It's far more harsh in a lot of ways. When you harm the gods or disrespect the gods or disrespect things like guest friendship, you deserve the harshest punishments, right? So this one moment of Odysseus offering a potential mercy, saying, look, when this guy comes, blood's going to spill. And he still didn't take it. That's what's darkness in mankind, I think.
But do you find him to have the capacity to leave?
Well, it's an interesting question because I think that... Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, that was my question, because it seems like Amphinomus feels anxious. You can tell, it seems like he's anxious and maybe even torn. But because he does not leave, that was my question, Deacon, was is that his free will to stay, or is it just because he is fated to die, and so that's where the chips fell?
Yeah, I mean, I think from the text itself, it's very difficult to read. I think, especially the fact that, I mean, in Latimore's, it says Athena had bound him fast to be strongly killed by the hands and spear of Telemachus. So it even foreshadows the fact that he's going to be murdered. But it's an interesting kind of read of human nature when it comes to things like peer pressure. And we don't really have a whole backstory with this individual suitor of like what his home life was like, why he's here, all that kind of stuff. So you'd almost have to read into the text a little bit as far as like free will specifically. But the fact that none of the suitors leave, I would say that certainly is some kind of godlike, hold on their will of some way. But it also goes back to the whole question of fate, which is so shadowy and very difficult to always kind of nail down in any of the ancient Greeks.
And I think too, one of the things that so last episode you talked about that, there's a general take on these Homeric texts that the Iliad is the book of war and the Odyssey is the book of peace, right? And that's like a way to contextualize them. And, I'm tempted to start connecting those to Achilles' shield. The other kind of trope, I guess, that you hear all the time is that, the Iliad is a very fatalistic book, right? I'm not sure anyone has any choice in the entire book that they actually made, right? It's everything is the gods. Then you kind of get this like caricature of like, well, the Odyssey has a lot more agency, a lot more free will, like Odysseus has these things. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know what this is. I think my third, fourth read through. This one, I'm really pushing against that internally. Like it's a dialogue I'm having about, does Odysseus and these characters actually have more human agency and free will than those in the Iliad? Or did Homer's rhetoric get better?
Mm.
Right? Because I guess part of my thing is like here, like I think we're seeing a lot of things about fate. And we're seeing that I think Athena is running a lot of interference. But then also, not to belabor the point, but if you start stacking up all the prophecies in the Odyssey about like this is what's going to happen, X, Y, and Z, you start to realize like a lot of key junctures of the book that most people would point to and say, well, here was a real choice. Like they had a real choice to eat the cattle or not. And they chose to, eat the cattle. If you really pay attention, a lot, even before they ever make it to the cattle, there are prophecies that Odysseus comes home by himself and no one recognizes him, right? That he's lost all of his men. But sometimes even after that prophecy, someone else will give prophecy and say, hey, you have two choices here. And so it's interesting for me, I'm trying in my mind to stack all these things and say, well, what is the free will relationship with fate here in the Odyssey? Because certain times it says that he has a choice and it seems to present a choice. Like Tiresias seems to present him a choice when he's in the underworld, right? Like if you eat the cattle, right, then this will happen to you. But if you don't eat the cattle, then you and your men will make it home. But there's already been like 3 prophecies that he's not going to make it home with his men. Right? So like, what is that? And then he's like always falling asleep or he's not there or the gods like, or like the gods are just like, well, you're just not going to have the right wind for 6 months or whatever. Right. And you just have to stay there. So I don't have like a hill to die on here, but I guess I'm wondering how much of that I think is just like a varnish that people just kind of, see and they say like, oh, the Odyssey, like it just, it has more human agency, etc. Or is that really something that we see reflected in the text, or has Homer's rhetoric gotten better? But I certainly think now in this kind of, so if you narrow it to just this book, I really doubt that any of the suitors have the capacity to leave. In fact, I think Athena wants us to make this as worse as humanly possible, or maybe divinely possible, right? Like every time someone gets a chance to do something correct, she seems to step in and not only not make them leave, but make them behave even worse than they would. Yes. Does that make sense? So it's not just like you can't leave. It's that, by the way, I'm going to make all your bad habits that make you guys devouring the house, I'm going to make them even worse. And she's just building up this pressure cooker.
Well, it kind of reminds me too, and this is just kind of off the top of my head as you were talking, something that kind of dawned on me. Athena is the god of reason, right? And so for her to bound somebody, it seems to me like they're playing out their ignorance. I mean, the fact that he takes off his clothing and they're like, whoa, this guy is, clearly a warrior, clearly jacked. Like, this isn't just some homeless beggar that's been eating bits of bread every day. Like, this guy knows what he's doing. And yet, none of them went, who is this person?
Right.
Like, you know what I mean? Instead, there was kind of the shade of ignorance that just stays there. It reminds me of Oedipus, where he's got this prophecy and he's trying to escape it. Yet, common sense would tell you, this lady looks a lot like me. That person I killed on the road is about the same age as my dad. Like these common sense things that it just now dawned on me, like, if Athena was really tying these people, it would be through ignorance, which, as you know, Aristotle says is one of the greatest slaveries that mankind can be in, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I just that just dawned on me just now of like, oh wow, I wonder if it's their ignorance that's keeping them in the house more
I
so
like
than
that.
anything else.
Yeah, so you treat her as a analog for wisdom, and then run with that what's happening here is that they're falling into their own imprudence and ignorance, and maybe not even ignorance, but that imprudence of being that fatherless generation, right? That they're just really dumb, mainly because they're brimming and saturated in pride, right? I mean, these are the young bucks that have never seen war, they haven't done anything, no one's been here to chastise them, and now they're just dumb. Because that's what I felt like the first time I read it. I'm like, guys, you've had 47 signs to get out of this house. Like, get out of the house, right? So, okay, well, let's keep pushing into this because Athena does a few other things too here. So the next thing that she does is Penelope's going to come out. And I have a few questions for you on this, but this, I think, lends into my narrative of like, she's basically doing everything possible to make the situation worse, right? So here comes Penelope out, and Athena is lavishing her with immortal gifts. She made her taller, fuller in form to all the men's eyes, her skin whiter than ivory, freshly carved. And then you skip down to like line 240 in Fagles, and the suitors' knees went slack, their hearts dissolved in lust. All of them lifted prayers to lie beside her. And so there's a few things going on here. I mean, one is that Athena, again, just seems to be just like, well, here's a fire. How can I add more gasoline to this, right? But what's interesting is that I think the narrative also really makes you question Penelope, because she comes out, and I'm still thinking about what you said last week about the chamber. And so I'm sure you have some thoughts on that, because I think this is really interesting. And also looking like Artemis or Aphrodite, right? These two very different goddesses. So she comes out, she's the most beautiful woman they've ever seen, which is interesting, right? Because that's not necessarily her key attribute, is her beauty, right? It's her intellect. But then we kind of see, like, there's a little narrative here where Telemachus, tries to speak to her, and he actually tells her the boy is gone. So we kind of, Homer's reminding us that Telemachus has his own little maturation story, as we're kind of going through this. Eurymachus, talks about you surpass all women in build and beauty, etc. Penelope then gives this long talk about, what it actually means to be a suitor and time-honored traditions and etc. And she basically gets them all into a frenzy, frothing them all up to bring her gifts. And it's interesting that Odysseus, and she kind of does it in this melodramatic kind of Eeyore way, and it's Odysseus that actually sees through this. It actually says down at like 15 or so, staunch Odysseus glowed with joy to hear all this, his wife's trickery, luring gifts from the suitors now. And I find that fascinating because, we've talked about this before, that I think that Odysseus's main attraction to his wife is her intellect, and really, really her cunning. Right? Because it's not intellect. She's not like a great philosopher, sometimes like the way we would use that, right? But she's the matchless queen of cunning. And so here she walks out, and just all these guys, hearts is just sloshing in lust. And it's interesting that Homer doesn't say anything about that affecting Odysseus. What actually makes him like kind of leap with joy is that his wife has outsmarted all 100 of the suitors, right? It's just kind of a beautiful, in its own kind of Greek way, picture as she kind of comes out of the chamber of the home, and he sees her in a certain way. He sees in her what he loves most, which is that trickery.
There's always the big question regarding these last few books of this work. It's always, did Penelope know, and when did she know? And so in book 17, whenever the beggar responds, "I'll come this evening," there's a few scholars that say that's when Penelope knew. There's some that disagree, but there's a line later on, I believe it's the second to last book, where he talks about how there are certain things that a husband and wife only know between the two of them. And so if you kind of like come back to this book, I always wonder, is Penelope playing out some kind of strategic plan that only Odysseus understands through all of this stuff, right? It kind of reminds me of, in Gladiator, the scene where he talks to his friend about praying and talking to his son and his wife, and he's like, to my wife, not for you to know. It's that whole, within a marriage, there are certain things that only the two of us get and understand. Our wit, our humor, there's just a certain level of it. So I always think that something's going on here, or somebody knows what's going on. And it could be that she knows what's about to happen. She's going to embarrass them to the fullest.
Well, I mean, to your point, here after 300, she talks about what Odysseus had told her. That, once you see a beard on the boy's cheek, you need to wed the man you like. So here, she's basically saying this time has come. Telemachus has become a man. Whether he has a beard or not, we've seen his own kind of, his own Odyssey, right? He's become the man of the house. He's taken the reins. So she sees in him, I think, that maturation as a man. And she's saying, hey, well, guess what, guys? After all this waiting, the time has come. And then she gives like a little cultural commentary on suitors and how they're supposed to bring gifts. And on one level, that is that trickery we're talking about, that Odysseus can tell if she's bringing out and luring these men into bringing her gifts. On the other way, I want to point to this passage because in previous episodes, and sometimes we've echoed some of the sentiments that have been shared in our Sunday Great Books, some people have really raised the question of whether the suitors are doing anything wrong, or to what degree are they doing something wrong, because shouldn't Penelope be remarrying at this point? Like, she should have her father choose someone for her. And what's interesting here is, like, this is, I think, the clearest picture that how the suitors are engaging in guest friendship and their pursuit of her is not culturally correct. Like, it's not just like it's wrong because we know Odysseus is coming back and therefore they're, whatever. But what they're doing is actually culturally wrong for the Hellenistic mind as well, just on its face. And so I think it's a good little cultural note there. But the whole scene takes on a really fascinating note if you think they both know, right? Because she's telling the whole group what Odysseus said, and now the time has come. She knows he's sitting over there. He's watching it, and then he's just loving her more because she's tricking everybody, right? So it's a temptation to try and guess when she knows, but it's a beautiful scene.
Something that Calypso did not offer.
No, she did not have the wit. So the suitors bring them gifts or bring Penelope gifts, and it actually lists out some of the gifts that the suitors, bring. And then we get, so around 360 or so, we are introduced to one of the serving women. And this goes into a narrative that we've been tracking. We talked about it last week with Argos. We noted that the serving women were the ones that were supposed to take care of Argos, and now he's laying neglected on a pile of dung and then dies. And so now we're given the name of one of them, Melantho, right? This is like in Fagles, it's like 365 or so. And not only do we find out that she's actually Eurymachus's lover, right? So they're pursuing Penelope while sleeping with the handmaids, in the house. And, I've had people push back on that, because in what way is that wrong? Right? Because we have to be careful, like, we're not reading, like, in what way is this wrong? Like, are we making a natural law argument here? Because you want to be careful, like, you're not reading back in, like, New Testament ethics, that things we have to have by revelation, right? But obviously marriage is a natural institution. But even, like, from a very thin Greek understanding of virtue at this time, like the handmaids, which are basically property of the house, have betrayed their master, right? So by sleeping with the servant or sleeping with the suitors, they betrayed Odysseus. And then that betrayal then I think bleeds out, because then we get very clearly here in this kind of back and forth that the female servants are at odds. They're antagonistic to Penelope, right? They've become antagonistic towards their own queen, very much so, actually. And so, I think that's one way to look at it. I think we could make some interesting natural law arguments in a more robust manner. But I think just on its face, these women are property of the house and they're disloyal to Odysseus. And now they're also disloyal to the queen. And, we're losing sympathy for them as the text goes on.
Yeah, and I think so. In my translation, it's around 320-ish, 322. It says Penelope had taken her in, talking about Melantho, and cared for her like a daughter, and cheered her with presents. But even so, her heart had no sorrow for Penelope. But she used to sleep with Eurymachus, and she was his sweetheart. And I think that what he's getting at here too is the maidservants should be just as angry about the way these people are acting and the way they're using up all of the house's goods, to the point where, I mean, if you are his sweetheart, it's not like he came in and raped you or something. It was something that you engaged in voluntarily. And so that's the betrayal of someone who treated basically her own quote unquote mother. She betrayed her own mother to do this, which is an acceptance of the other behaviors, right? So it's a whole, like, yeah, not only are they doing this, but they're cool with it.
Right.
They're perfectly fine with the suitors acting this way. So there's kind of like the two levels of, yes, there's the sexual ethic of the Greek world that was certainly very different than ours, but I think the guest friend thing was even higher as far as like a virtue. And so for them to understand these people are breaking all of those rules, yet I'm going to go to bed with one. That's a total acceptance of what's going on.
And I wonder in what way you could contextualize her as a usurper, too, right? Because Eurymachus is trying to wed Penelope to have the house, but if he's actually secretly, like, the lover of this, female servant, like, what is that going to mean for Penelope, once he has the home, right? Is that not positioning her to be against Penelope in the future, like in a more robust way? So, yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. But you're seeing these relationships play out behind the scenes, which, clearly you're losing sympathy for these. I mean, if you had any sympathy to begin with, you're kind of losing it more and more, right? There's this friction throughout the text.
Yeah. And I think it also shows that Eurymachus had zero interest in Penelope other than land title and money, right?
Yeah.
Because if he's doing this, it's not like he was lusting after Penelope primarily. It was this girl.
Well, he seems to be the one, too, that's presented most as the hypocrite. So, like, Antinous is just dumb. Like, we know what he is. He's going to say what he thinks, right? Like, he's just dumb. But Eurymachus is the one that, even Telemachus spoke highly of at one point. He thought about sending the prophet that came with him to his house, if I remember correctly. Eurymachus has said, and even here, like, we find out he's sleeping with one of the servant girls, and then in, like, around 400, Eurymachus is kind of laying it on thick and giving, compliments. And he's done this in another passage where he talks to Telemachus, he tells Penelope that everything with Telemachus will be okay. And Homer tells us explicitly that he's planning to murder, Telemachus, that he's holding murder for Telemachus in his heart. So Eurymachus tends to be the one, too, who is presented most as, the hypocrite, if that makes sense, right? What he says and what he does are most distinct. I'm sure you could play that out against Odysseus in certain ways if you wanted to.
Yeah, and something too that it's kind of just a small point, but twice in this chapter, and the use of it kind of goes through this whole work. But Homer uses or at least in the Lattimore translation, it says ravenous belly. So it actually describes Irus as someone known to fame for his ravenous belly. And then here in 360, Eurymachus is talking to Odysseus, basically saying, like, you're nothing more than a ravenous belly. And that to me is a sign of what Homer is doing, of like self-control, virtue, right? Because the natural man just wants to fill the ravenous belly, whereas Odysseus has to come into his own home, being able to control those lower urges, right? To be able to find himself as a full man.
I like that a lot. There's another line, as we kind of track this narrative, 391. But Athena had no mind to let the brazen suitors hold back now from their heart-rending insults. She meant to make the anguish cut deeper into the core of Laertes' son, Odysseus. So again, here she is pouring that gasoline on the fire, right? She's not only just not allowing them to leave, but this is going to become worse. The kind of final little narrative that we have here is Eurymachus, and again, this kind of hypocrite, he offers Odysseus the beggar work. I mean, he's very much trying to show himself. I mean, he understands that the suitors are seen as being idiots. And so he's kind of setting himself up as like, he's the gentleman amongst them. And he offers Odysseus, work. And Odysseus like responds back by basically saying like, I'm more of a man than you, like I could work the field better than you, etc. What's interesting though here is that in certain ways I think Odysseus is revealing Eurymachus for who he is, right? Because Eurymachus can't stand this. Like he breaks, like this mask he has slips. And then he goes on this long tirade against Odysseus the beggar, which ironically ends up in him throwing a stool again. This is apparently a thing that you do when you get mad at people at feasts, right?
WWE style.
Right, just off the top rope. Here we go. You grab your folding chair, and so he chunks the stool, which doesn't hit him. It hits one of the wine servants, if I remember correctly. But I think that it's really interesting here that both Eurymachus and Odysseus have a mask. Right, they're both masking a certain person, and then they interact. And Odysseus just takes Eurymachus out to lunch. Yeah. Right. I mean, it just falls apart. Right. So in front of Telemachus, in front of Penelope, in front of everyone, Eurymachus is somewhat revealed, as what all those suitors are. This kind of hot-tempered, prideful, individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting too that as Eurymachus or Eurymachus, however we want to say it, as his falls, you see the anger, you see the lack of self-control. Whereas with Odysseus, he's still himself. Even of course, granted, he dodged this one, but he's been hit the stool before and he just took it and stared at a guy. So
right.
He just sticks with it.
Yeah, I was trying to put what's the one sentence to summarize this book. I try to do that for each book, and one of the things I thought of for this one was just Homer just really wants you to hate the suitors, and it just seems like Athena forces them to commit greater and greater offenses. So Odysseus will basically not spare a single one of them when battle begins. But when you see Eurymachus Eurymachus throw this stool, Odysseus, like you said, Dr. Zimmerer, that he shows this self-restraint, this self-control that was really very, very impressive. In fact, I remember thinking man, I don't remember seeing this type of self-control from him in the Iliad. And I don't know why. That was just kind of my I don't have the back. I didn't go back and look, but just I just remember my perception of him was not the same of self-control in the Iliad than as what I saw late here in the Odyssey.
Yeah, I don't know if my summary of book 18, I need to go back and kind of think of what Dr. Zimmerer said about this being a test of Odysseus, because I found the first half with the beggar fight to be somewhat disjointed outside of just showing more mockery of guest friendship, of why do we have this interlude. But then we do have, Penelope walking out in glory, if you will, Odysseus liking her because of her intellect. I mean, there's certain things that I think it adds, but I'm not really sure. I think it pushed the story forward, and our pace has also just slowed tremendously. So I need to go back and kind of think about an overarching, narrative. But anything else on kind of book 18? Anything that we missed, or any thoughts?
Yeah, and you kind of mentioned it, but there's some great lines in there about Telemachus kind of growing up and becoming a man and facing the suitors, which he just couldn't do before. And he calls them fools, they're out of their minds, all that kind of stuff. Literally tells them to go home, which he could have done 10 years ago, but he had to grow up, had to have his father at his side, stuff like that. So it's a beautiful arc in his character development for sure.
It is. I think one of the most beautiful parts of that is not just he's obviously bringing in the maturity and the virtue of his own little Odyssey that he went on, that I do think he matures on, but also the son having such greater self-respect and self-identity when he knows his father has his back and is in the room. Right, that's that intimacy between the father and son relationship that Telemachus was really lacking at the beginning of the text. Right, his father was an idea. Right, he even says at one point, right, about Odysseus, was it all a dream? He's never met him. He doesn't know. He might just be a dream. So now that he's this real person, Telemachus is allowed, to mature really into a man. It is. It's a beautiful relationship of father and son. All right, very good.
Awesome.
Dr. Zimmerer, we appreciate you being here with us again, helping us through first book 17 and now book 18. Can you remind people where they can find you?
Sure. So my handles on pretty much everything is just Jared Zimmerer. But then also what I'm doing here at Benedictine College, you can find at media.benedictine.edu, and we got a lot of content on there for people to take in.
All right, thank you.
Awesome.
Adam,
And
you
as a
wanna take it?
reminder, you guys can check out the show notes and everything on thegreatbookspodcast.com. Be sure to follow us on social media, and be sure to send us pictures of you guys reading through the text together and any insights you guys have on Book 18 that we'd not get a chance to get to. This has been Ascend, the Great Books Podcast. We'll see you next week.
See you guys.